thank you for coming. Today we're going to be chatting with Paul Heaston. Paul is a fabulous Uber sketcher and oil painter and an artist, a stay-at-home dad and an art instructor and an urban sketcher. And we're really lucky to be able to have some of his time because he's a really busy guy. And I'm so grateful to be able to chat with Paul today. He's going to do an ink and wash demo. And so let's go. So everyone, welcome. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, everybody. I see some names I know. So hi, I see Mike and a few people here. Yep. So thanks for the wonderful invitation to do this, Brenda. I think this is our second one of these, and hopefully it goes off even more glitch-free than the last time, right?
I hope so.
We are here in, I'm here in Denver, Colorado. And that is where I have been for the last 8 years as an urban sketcher, but I've been urban sketching for I think about 13 years now. And done it all over the world. I've traveled and taught urban sketching now, quite a few different places. Brenda and I first met in Brazil.
Yeah.
So, we've known each other for about 6 years now.
Yep.
And if you're not familiar with my work, one of the things I've been doing, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, is ink wash and pen and ink drawing. So prior to that, and prior to my discovery of ink wash as a way for laying down light and dark, or values, as I like to say, I was somebody who I did black and white sketching, but I was much more of a crosshatcher. I still do that too, but when I was in the UK for the symposium in Manchester, I met Ed Mostly, and if you're not following him on social media, go look for Ed Mostly, EDMOSTLY. And he showed me a technique, so I can't take credit for this at all, but he showed me a technique of using diluted ink in a water brush, because before that, I had been experimenting with markers, grayscale markers. Tombow makes some, Faber-Castell makes some, a few others, and I wasn't particularly enamored of the way they worked, and I was still mostly doing cross-hatching. But he showed me his technique of laying down values real quick. So if you need some shadows in there real quick, using not black ink but gray ink that's also diluted. And the ink that I've been using is Noodlers, which if you know fountain pens, you're probably familiar with this ink brand, and it's called Lexington Gray. And it is it's a fountain pen ink, because fountain pen inks work the best in these water brushes. Now, there's a bunch of different people who make water brushes. The kinds that I really like are, this is Sakura, who are the same people who make Micron pens and Jelly Roll pens and things like that. That's a Micron pen, which most urban sketchers, I think, would probably be familiar with. And then I also use these Derwent brush pens, water brush pens, whatever. And also Pentel makes them, a few others. So it might be worth it to find a brand, or to try a couple of different brands and find the ones you're comfortable with. Most of the ones that aren't the really bargain basement budget brands, I found work pretty well. And all of them have the potential, if you're not careful, to leak a little bit or to get a little clogged. Ed Mostly recommends that when you dilute your ink in a water brush, to use distilled water, which I'm just lazy enough that I haven't tried that yet, but I do try and clean these regularly. Because even though this is a fountain pen ink, and therefore it's not a pigmented ink like an India ink or an acrylic ink, it can still possibly or potentially clog that. And that's not really due to the ink, but to the mineral compounds found in tap water. And it depends probably on where you live, if you have a hard water town or a soft water town. So the harder your water, the more minerals. I don't even know. I'm not a chemist or anything, but then that might affect how quickly these clog. But I would bet that's true whether or not you're putting ink in these. If you're just putting water in these to use them with watercolor, which is something else that I do, they might eventually, you just get little, we have lime and lime scale here in Denver that builds up, because I can see it in our, in our faucets and things like that. And you have to soak it in vinegar. But for the most part, I haven't had any real issues with clogging. Um, One thing everybody asks me about this, and before we show some work, because that's the fun part, is the ratio of ink to water that I use. And for me, it's not an exact ratio. It really depends on how dark I want my initial stroke to be. And I want something in the neighborhood of about 50% darkness so that I can get a little bit darker, 50% as dark as the undiluted ink, I should say. So I can get a little bit darker when I add more ink, and I can get a little bit lighter if I add more water to the brush. So I'll usually add some ink and some water, test it. If I'm not kind of happy with that dilution, I'll adjust it accordingly. And then another thing I've done frequently is have a couple of different brushes available with different dilutions. One that'll be pretty light, and then one that'll be pretty dark if I don't want to waste time going over. Because the cool thing about this ink is it's waterproof once it's dry. So unlike watercolor, if you were using just gray watercolor on a watercolor paper, if you keep going over it, you can sometimes lift up that value because watercolor is still water soluble unless you seal it. And this, once it's dry, because it's waterproof, you can go back over it and get darker and darker and darker layers, which is what we'll show in the demo. So Brenda, I wasn't sure, do you think I should show images first and then do the video demo, or do you think we should jump right into the demo?
You're the boss.
Let's take a look at some images.
Okay.
I think some sketchbook images, so you know what I'm talking about and how I use ink wash.
Can
And
you
this
see
is good
that?
because that's the perfect one to start with, because this is one of my earliest ones. And so here I used a fountain pen with carbon platinum ink. This is a real dark black ink. And then rather than hatching in all the shadows and values and things like that, on top of that, I laid down, and it's a waterproof ink, I should say. This will only work, well, I mean, it'll work with the not waterproof ink, but you're going to get some smearing and smudging of your ink. So I would recommend using waterproof ink either in your fountain pen, or if you're using a regular pen, I would say like a Micron, any kind of fine liner pens. They usually say that they're archival, waterproof, fade proof, that kind of thing. So this was carbon platinum ink, and then I went on top of that with the Noodler's Lexington Gray, and this was over in Lookout Mountain, just about 45 minutes from here in Denver.
Can I ask you a question, Paul?
Sure.
So are you moving, like in the chronology of your life as an artist, are you moving away from crosshatch towards this ink and wash? Now you're using it more often, or you sort of use crosshatch and ink and wash sort of, intermittently?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I'll use both. Cross hatching is definitely more time consuming, and I think from a time management perspective, I like the way I can rapidly add value with the ink wash. Ink wash, is something you can do all sorts of ways. The way I do it is nice because it's real portable and it's less messy by having the ink already mixed up and diluted in a pen or a water brush, I should say. But obviously, you can bring a bottle of ink and some water and a little well for mixing those, those washes, and you can mix them outside of, the ink bottle or your water bottle, not unlike adding water to watercolor. And you can do that too. You can add an ink wash that way, and you just need a regular brush, not a water brush, to do that.
Yeah.
But I like the no mess feature of the water brush, and the fact that if you layer it, it gets darker, is great, because then you don't have to worry about having a bunch of them on hand because you only have one dilution in a particular water brush.
Right.
But yeah, I'll still mix in cross hatching from time to time, and some sketches I still do exclusively with cross hatching. So it just depends on my mood and also how much time I think I want to give to a sketch.
Yeah, so this is a great way to really speed up your sketching, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've been trying to do that last 4 or 5 years. That's hence the fountain pens, especially Fude nib fountain pens, which have a real bold kind of a painterly line.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to, I found my line was being a little too fiddly, and I also was holding my pen when I was using just these fine liner Micron pens. I was holding them in a way that was giving me a lot of hand and wrist pain.
Oh,
And so one thing I started doing is holding them further back on the barrel, so further away from the point and from the surface of the paper,
yeah.
holding them a little more loosely, like a painter might hold a paintbrush. And then another thing is using fountain pens, which just seem to flow a little bit more. They have a, I don't know, much more fluid feel on the page without as much pressure. And so those are two things that have sped up my sketching, also made it a little bit more gestural, and then adding the water brush just seemed to go naturally with that goal.
Okay, I have a
So,
question for you
sure.
from MK. Hi, MK.
Hi.
So MK says her experience with Lexington Gray is that it's not completely waterproof. Does that matter?
It's not entirely waterproof. None of the Noodler's inks are, but it's part of what they call their bulletproof line. And I've found that versus the other Noodler's inks, it's a little bit more waterproof than most. But the thing that I really like about it is how neutral it is. Some inks that are called gray can be a little too cool and they don't
Okay.
match the black that I'm using. And then other ones can be a little too warm or reddish. And so if you look at that image there, that's a real down the pipe neutral gray.
Yep.
One thing that can happen though that's kind of funny about Lexington Gray is if it does sit for a long time in the brush without you using it and you don't shake it up, mix it up or whatever, some of the whatever the dye is that's creating the color will separate from the binder in the ink, and then you get some bluish tinge to the ink. So it does can't when it starts to separate, it can get a little blue, but if you mix it up, shake it up a lot, I find that that'll go away. I don't know why that happens, and I don't know enough about the chemistry of how it works to explain it, but that has happened once or twice to me. So yeah, let's look at another image here.
Ooh.
Now here's one compared to the last one. This one I'm using both gray ink in the water brush and gray ink undiluted in my fountain pen, and so it almost has a pencil feel to it. Because the lines aren't near as dark, so there's a nice softness, and I kind of like that sometimes. I don't like the harshness of black ink sometimes, and so this feels a little less graphic, despite all the perspective lines and things happening. And so that's something you can try too if you have a fountain pen, is to try gray ink and then a gray ink wash on top, and there's a real softness to the sketch. There's a lot of harmony between the line work and the brush work. And so I really like that.
Beautiful. That's amazing. Fabulous. One point
Yeah.
perspective.
And then let's go to another one. Let's see, the one with, you might have to go backwards, I think. It doesn't
Yeah.
loop around for some reason. And
There we go.
all right, I did this one this Christmas. And this one was, I think the line work is all with a micron pen.
Wow.
So real fine line work. But in a few spots, not only did I do the value work with a water brush, but I did some lines with the water brush too. If you get a nice fine line water brush, like a Derwent #1, that has a real thin, narrow brush, some of the brick lines over on the door on the right are probably brushed lines rather than drawn with a pen. And maybe even one of the light fixtures on top, the one that's more just contour liney. And then there's some figures in the background on the left hand that I really like how loose and undetailed they are, and it's a great contrast to all the crazy detail that's happening in the machinery there in the front. This is in a hotel lobby in San Antonio, Texas,
And what
and
is it?
I think it's a pump, or it used to be a pump, as part of a distillery, or not a distillery, but a brewery. So there's a hotel called the Pearl Hotel. It used to be the Pearl Brewery, where they made Pearl beer, which was a Texas beer brand back in the 20th century. And I think they went out of business about 30 years ago. But they've since converted the brewery into a hotel, but they kept a lot of the historical, the vintage machinery and stuff in there. And now it's sort of decoration in the lobby.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and it was cool. I was just sitting on a nice little comfortable couch looking at this, and I thought that would be a good sketch.
It is. It's really cool. Oh, okay. Didn't know that I could do that. All right.
So here's you see, by the way, I should say this is where I'm using cross hatching and this at the same time as ink wash, and I think the double layer of sort of texture and value can make it an even more interesting sketch.
hmm It is. So Libby is asking, how long does it take to make a sketch? Like a sketch like this, how long would that take?
I think this was in the neighborhood of 2 hours.
Wow.
So something as complicated as this, there's a quick pencil sketch that goes in first, so I can kind of figure out the proportions of everything without diving into pen. And then I'll probably do a little bit of contour line work, then go in with the ink wash, and then come back on top of that with some more hatching. So it's a process, a back and forth process with the ink wash and the line work to get the textures and the values to where I'm happy with them.
I don't know if you said this already or not, but is that ink that you put in the Derwent water brush the same ink that you've got in your fountain pen?
In the last drawing, it was the Noodler's Lexington Gray.
Yeah.
But in this drawing and in the first drawing of the trees, I was using platinum carbon ink, which I have not tried diluting. It is one of the few pigmented fountain pen inks, so it has the right viscosity for fountain pens, but it has pigment instead of dye, which means it's truly an archival type of ink. It's waterproof and light fast, which means it won't fade. But I feel like it's thick enough that it might clog a water brush more quickly. So I've been a little bit hesitant to use it inside the water brush. And then in this case, this was, I think, just Micron pens, which, are just disposable pens with black ink inside. They make different colors of Micron too, but I just usually use the black.
Okay,
But
cool.
yeah, and that's about a 2 hour sketch. One other thing you can notice here is brushwork is good for kind of an atmospheric perspective, making the background a little bit less detailed, especially on the left-hand side, just giving a little bit of a little bit of attention to the values in the background, but not going overboard with the detail because I want the detail kind of front and center in the foreground.
Right.
So I don't get too crazy in the background.
And it was great for the shadows there underneath the bench and
Mm-hmm.
on that bottom on the left side. It's really cool.
And then can you go to the last one real quick? And then I want to show the demo so we don't run out of time. And then here's another one with gray ink in my fountain pen as well as the Lexington Gray ink in my water brush. So it kind of almost blurs the line between what part is water brush and what part is the ink. And I like that harmonious feeling of it. And then there's a little bit of wash there on the street too. Now, here's where I have forgotten to talk about the materials that I'm working on, the surfaces. So usually I use something like a Stillman and Burn. This is an Epsilon Stillman and Burn sketchbook. And Stillman and Burn sketchbooks all have a surface and an interior sizing like watercolor paper or mixed media paper, which makes it great for laying down ink wash without too much buckling of the paper. But I would say if you're going to be trying ink wash, rather than go with a bond paper or a thin paper that's good for just line work, I would use something that you would use for, say, watercolor, because ink wash, of course, is real wet. And even though it dries pretty quickly, it can cause buckling of cheaper papers or papers that aren't suited for wet media. So use something that's appropriate for wet media.
Yeah.
And that's for our demo. That's the paper I'm using too.
So I don't know if it's the truck or not, but it seems to me that this black and white, especially with the wash, it has like this vintage feel, like a black and white photo, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the softness and the fact that it's both probably the subject, that truck makes it look old-fashioned, but it's also, I'm not using a black ink, but a gray ink, even for the pen work. And then if you look in the background, that background tree, a lot of the branches of that are straight up brush.
Yeah.
If you can zoom in
Can I zoom in?
with the little plus symbol, there you go. Yeah, can you see there's no line work on some of the branches in the back tree,
Yeah.
especially kind of on the left-hand side. You see those darker branches that are behind the foreground tree?
Yeah. Yeah.
You can really see that that's just brushwork.
Hmm.
And it's really great for that. So it's a lot of fun. It's the ink is semi-transparent, the gray ink, and when you layer it, you get little darks. So little knobs and things like that were fun to do. Um, and I find that treeless or leafless trees, like wintertime trees, are much more fun for me to sketch here in Denver. And we have a long season when there's no leaves on the trees. So, but the weather's not too terrible. So to go out and sketch at that time is fun for me.
Yeah.
Full screen.
All right, here we go.
So the first thing I did here is I'm doing a quick a value scale in a rectangle. And this is, I'm trying to keep the ink as wet as possible. The cool thing about water brushes, if you squeeze, you get a little bit more ink come out, ink will come out because it does dry quick. I think it dries a little quicker than watercolor. And as you go through it and it starts to dry, I start to kind of darken up those areas. Here I am trying to tap out some extra ink. There you go. And you get some little bubbly stuff sometimes, but that'll just disappear. Those bubbles will pop eventually. And so I'm trying to do a wet on wet value scale where I'm getting darker on the left-hand side. At some point, though, there's diminishing returns, and you can't really get super dark until you let the darkest parts dry and go back over them. And I don't remember how long I took with this value scale, so I'll try and talk my way through it.
So the advantage is that you can just layer. You can just keep, as long as
Yeah,
you've got good paper, you can just keep layering and layering to get the
exactly.
darkness
And
that
this
you
is a
want.
nice mixed media or wet media paper.
Mhm.
So you just keep layering, and that wet on wet, the advantage also is that you don't get the tide marks, the overlap marks that you would if you let it layer dry and then go back on top of it. So you get a much smoother transition between your dark and light if you're trying to keep areas wet, so it'll kind of bleed into the light areas more cleanly. But because it is a semi-waterproof ink, as it dries, you're still going to get some areas that dry quicker and aren't as smooth in terms of the values.
So
Um,
just a question for you.
mhm,
If this is waterproof ink and you did a sketch, say like the tree sketch that you showed us, or the ones you just showed us,
mhm.
and you've done the whole thing with waterproof ink, you can then afterwards, after it's all dry, go in with watercolor and just lay some color in, a wash over
Yes,
it.
you can, and I have done that, and I've done that where I've added my values with the gray brush prior, and then gone on top of that, and then so then your watercolor, even if you just lay on a flat layer of the watercolor, it's already got a built-in value in it.
Yeah, yeah.
So your highlights and your shadows are already laid down, and so it can go pretty quick this way. Now here's me. I'm trying to do thin layers that dry quickly and then go back on top to show you a different way to do value scale if you don't mind the tide marks. And sometimes it's nice to get that kind of graphic quality or those overlapping lines because of the transparent ink. So this is a different kind of value scale to show you what happens when you let a value dry and then you go back on top of it with another layer of the ink wash. And I probably didn't give it quite enough time in this demo to really dry, but I think the idea, the concept is evident. Um, and so if you're somebody like me who works slow, it's kind of hard to keep a wash wet long enough to get all your gradients um, blended, especially if you keep coming back to an area and going, oh, that's not dark enough. I think I need to get a little bit darker. So this is how I would handle that. And I don't find that particularly distracting, the overlap and those what we call tide marks, or if you've ever used a marker, you know about those. And if you're good with marker, you know how to use those to your advantage. Well, it's a similar way of working. So you can see how that gradient's starting to form there. The one thing I would say about working with a gray ink rather than a black diluted ink is you can only get as dark as your original ink. So it's only ever going to get to about, I think this Lexington gray is about 75, 80% as dark as, say, a black ink. So when it's straight up coming out and you don't have a black ink to compare it to, it does look pretty dark. But then as soon as you start adding black ink in your drawing, you're going to see the difference. So you see that? That's a pretty good smooth gradient, even
Yeah.
letting those layers dry. And then I'll show you real quick how you might use negative space to your advantage. One thing I like to call out how bright or brilliant or three-dimensional something is. One of the tricks, of course, is if you know that light objects tend to pop out in space and dark objects or dark spaces tend to recede. That's kind of one of the principles of design
Right.
and composition. Then you can use that to your advantage with using these ink washes, and it goes so much quicker than trying to generate a middle value with lots and lots of hatch marking, because especially when you've got a lot of space to fill, and you're trying to show that negative space, show it off, to highlight an object that isn't particularly dark. It's way quicker, and I think sometimes a little bit more appealing even, really, to just go in with this ink wash. So here's me doing just a standard, I don't know, a billiard ball or something like that, a cue ball, something, that has a sort of the values on it are very light,
Yeah.
and then the background is real dark. And something else I'm doing there, this is just a good technique in terms of understanding light and shadow, is I'm creating something called a core shadow. And that is where the darkest part of the shadow on an object, especially a smooth or shinier object, like let's say a billiard ball, is going to be just before the edge of that object. So that's where the shadow is darkest. And then there's a tiny little highlight on the right-hand side of that ball that's not as bright as the brightest part of the ball that's receiving lots of light, but it's bright enough that it highlights the transition between the ball and the background.
Yeah.
And so if you haven't tried it, think about core shadows, especially with objects that are reflective or shiny or smooth. And the reason that that's light right there is because some of that ball is picking up or is reflecting what's around it, the light that's around it, even if it's not directly receiving a light source.
Yeah. Cool. I have a question for you here
Sure.
from Regula. Hi, Regula. You're only the third person I've ever met with the name Regula, and the other two Regulas are lovely.
Hello.
So Regula says, what paper do you use, and how relevant is it to choose the right one, specifically with the ink?
It's important. Like as I was saying, I like wet media friendly papers. I think of all the examples that I was showing you, 3 of those were Stillman and Byrne Epsilon paper, which is a nice bright white but wet media friendly sketch paper. And then the other one, the one that was the hotel lobby with the machinery, was Etcher hot press watercolor sketchbook. Etcher, ETCHR, and that's a brand out of Australia, I believe.
Cool. And I have another question for you here from our buddy Mike, Dr. Barra, who's amazing. And he says, do you have a bottle of pre-mixed ink for the water brush, or do you make a new mixture for each brush you fill in?
That's a good question. I always do it every time I refill it. For one thing, I think I haven't quite settled on something that I think works 100% of the time. So I'm always trying to have a better understanding of what mixtures I like. And the other reason might be that just out of sheer laziness of trying to pre-mix a bunch of it. A little bit of ink goes a long way. This is only, I think in 4 years, this is my 2nd bottle of Lexington Gray. So this is about halfway done now, and I'll probably purchase another one soon, but it hasn't been particularly, it doesn't run out so quick that I'm eager to pre-mix a bunch of it though.
Yeah.
And I like to use the ink straight up sometimes in my pens, so I don't want to, sacrifice an entire bottle and start diluting it immediately. Here's just a ball where the ball is a little bit darker, but it has a highlight, and I'm trying to show you getting a gradient built up to that highlight and keeping it dark with just the water brush. So real quick, that was just a dark ball with a highlight, and then this is just another way. I was trying to demo, I don't think this one came out so hot because I wasn't looking at anything, but trying to demo how negative space is effective in showing things popping in value. So I did some tree branches, because tree branches are one of those things that's real tricky with pen and ink to be subtle about. And so I like ink wash for that reason.
Um, and also, Regular has another question. Why not just use black ink? Why not just use black ink and dilute it further? Would it get too diluted at one point?
You know, I haven't tried it that much. I think I've tried it once or twice. My preferred fountain pen ink, though, as I was saying earlier, is the carbon black ink, which doesn't dilute particularly well, and it's a little too thick. But I would suspect, I think probably any of the black Lexington, or not black Lexington, but black Noodler's inks might work. One thing, though, is that when you dilute black ink, as opposed to an ink that's formulated to be gray, like Lexington gray, you can see more of the source pigment. And oftentimes, when you make the ink more transparent, you can tell how blue or red an ink is. And there's oftentimes, or even green, inks have a base, black inks have a base that's, when it's concentrated, it comes out looking really black. But once you start to dilute it and it gets more transparent, you can see more and more of the color that makes up the base pigment of that ink, or the base dye of that ink. And so for that reason, I've been sticking to the Lexington gray because of its neutrality. Um, if you want, I mean, there's nothing to stop you from trying that, but it's a funny thing. If you ever put a bunch of different pens down to see how waterproof they are, like a ballpoint pen or something like that, that are black, and then you put some clear water on top and rub it in, you'll suddenly start to see the color inside that black ink. They're so concentrated that they look black, but once you start to smudge them and smear them, you can see that base come out. It's a fun test to do, especially really non-archival inks like ballpoint inks, things like that, that are super squirrely and don't get along well with water. It's fun to see what happens when you start to, when you get them wet.
Mm-hmm. I'm really amazed by this sort of it's your theme lately, Paul, how everything looks so vintage with the ink wash.
Yeah, it's such a fun technique, and it has this quality, this softness, and it's more organic, and it feels to me a lot less fiddly and fussy than my previous work when it was all pen and ink, or all, you know,
Hatching, all the
hatch mark,
hatching.
which was almost too it was just a little too stiff, and this
Yeah.
kind of brings something to it.
Yeah. Well,
And
I
then,
mean, hatching takes a long time, but the result is so gorgeous, so beautiful.
yeah, and it took me a long time to get good at it, and then it also took me a long time. It takes me a long time to do an individual piece with hatching, and I think the learning curve is also not near as steep for using ink wash, especially if you're somebody coming from watercolor. The way I work, I find myself, I'm a little bit of an outlier in the urban sketching community because of how much I crosshatch. There's a few of us out there. It's not like I'm alone doing crosshatching.
Yeah.
But so many more sketchers who would like to try black and white sketching, they come from a watercolor comfort level that I don't have. And I feel like ink wash is a great way for them to break into just pen and ink sketching and have it be feel natural and not completely alien to them. Whereas if
Well,
you try to break into just cross hatching, it might be a little strange.
so Paul, you realize that with this ink wash, you're just one step away from watercolor.
Oh, I know, and I every now and then do watercolor, and it might surprise people to learn. And I don't know why I moved the paper here. I'm very sorry I did that. But this is my last demo here. This was the I was going to do a car. I do a lot of cars lately, a lot of parked cars, because of my daughter's nap schedule. And pre-quarantine, when I was driving my wife to work and dropping her off, I would come back, and my daughter would fall asleep. My youngest, she just turned 2. But she would always fall asleep for a morning nap around 10 in the morning. So I would find myself pulling over to let her sleep because she's not good at transitioning out of the car seat and into her crib. So
Yeah.
I just let her sleep in the car seat,
Yeah.
and I would pull over and find a place where there's something interesting on the side of the road, and usually it was a parked car,
Yeah.
and start sketching those. And I want to show you quickly how I might approach. It's all about values for me, light and dark. So this was a Subaru wagon, not a Subaru, a Volvo station wagon that had, I love them because of their boxy shape.
Yeah.
And it had some snow had just fallen. So there was a light dusting of snow on there. So I wanted to highlight the dark maroon paint of the Subaru versus the snow that was on top of the hood and some of the windows and a little bit on the wheel wells, and show you how I might approach that with almost exclusively ink wash. And then at the end, I add a little bit of dark line to just heighten some of the values and pull some of those details out a little bit sharper than I can do with an ink wash.
Yeah.
So watch as it goes. It goes so quickly. And it's, to me, it's just a real fun thing to see the sketch emerge
Yeah.
like that, um, where it's not so, it's a much more deliberate process with pen and ink, and you don't get as quick of an instant gratification feeling.
Yeah.
And here you really, it's so gratifying to see everything just sort of show up.
You're
And there
so
was a
good
little
with
like,
you're so good with trucks and cars and so on, Paul.
yeah, of
Honestly,
course, I should say.
a lot of people struggle. They really struggle with cars.
They
And I think
struggle, and
it's,
it's such a funny thing because it's such a
well,
part of the urban landscape. But I know a lot of people are, they kind of try to look past them, and I used to do that too. I would try to ignore them.
yeah, but they have, well, the shape is different every single time.
Hmm.
They all, and they, because they're streamlined what is that called, where the air goes over it?
Yeah,
Streamlining them,
aerodynamic and
aerodynamic. And so sometimes they're going in or they're going out, or they're
yeah. So they're not like buildings because
no,
they have weird shapes, and almost every car, like you said, is unique. And
yeah,
then you're going to see them at a different angle almost every time.
yeah,
And to me, I found the challenge of them. I'm not a car person, and we were talking about this because I've always wondered, and you also were pointing out, like, if that's more of a guy interest thing or not. The funniest thing is that I think I got my interest from France Van Stone. She's a sketcher in New
yeah,
Jersey,
yeah,
and she goes by the handle Wagonized, and she was doing these Volvo wagons at first, which is why she started doing that. Um, and she's always been into the sketching cars too. But of course, Florian Offlerbach, rest in peace, who passed away a few years ago, but was brilliant sketching cars in Le Pen, Barcelona. And I don't think he owns a car. My car is, I've sketched my car quite a bit, but it's not a cool old vintage car or anything. It's an '06 Toyota Camry. Um, but I don't know why I find them irresistible as sketching subjects, not because I'm a car nut or anything like that. I couldn't tell you, if you open a car up, I couldn't tell you what's what inside.
yeah,
I leave that to the professionals, but then,
yeah, yeah.
I'm a professional sketcher, so that's my thing.
I mean, really, it comes down to shapes, and that's what all drawing is about. Is you're just putting shapes down on paper.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
there's something about cars that a lot of people really struggle with them, with the shapes. So I have a question for you here from Marlene. She says, "My biggest struggle with cars are the wheels. Do you have any advice?"
Yeah, I can tell you there's some tricks to wheels. For one thing, getting those ellipse shapes right is the tricky part for me. I think that's the end of the demo, but real quick, I'll say, oh no, not yet. I'm gonna do a little pen and ink work. I want to remind everybody that I have a vintage car sketching workshop with Studio 56, and that's kind
Vintage
of one of
truck.
the reasons. A truck, that's right, vintage truck. That was my problem recording. I kept introducing it wrong too. Yeah. So to get a real in-depth look at how I do that, and I talk about it for about an hour and 10 minutes, so you get a lot of information just on sketching this vintage truck. But I think the same thing applies to vintage cars too, or any car. And so I do talk a little bit about wheels in that one, but because that one had flat tires, I don't give it enough time. So practicing those foreshortened ellipse shapes
Yeah,
when a tire is not straight in front of you, and it's not a perfect circle. The trick is thinking about that ellipse. And one of the funny things is ellipses in perspective, they start to tilt. So they're not straight up and down ovals. But look at the ellipses in this car. They're kind of tilted to the right. So if you were to draw a line across those ellipses down there at their widest spot, where the wheel is tallest, you would see that line is kind of tilted towards the top right. And that's a thing. I think that little trick right there is most of what people's problem is in getting those ellipse shapes right. when you're
Oh,
sketching a car.
I'm not sure I got what you just said.
I'll say it again.
Yeah.
So when you're drawing an ellipse, they're not straight up and down ovals
Right.
where the longest point is a vertical line. Instead, imagine that their longest diameter of that ellipse shape is tilted a little bit to the right. That's if they're kind of facing towards your right. If those wheels were kind of facing a little bit more to your left, then you would probably have them tilting a little bit to the left. So that's what happens when an ellipse gets foreshortened. That's a perspective kind of tip for you, and that can really help. And if you want, after the video is over, I'll sketch it real quick and hold it up to the camera to show what I mean, because I think that was a good question.
Yeah.
Find myself a little quick sketchbook here.
I have another little question here.
Mm-hmm.
So Mike is asking, what's your strategy for keeping the white of the paper as opposed to using white gel pens for the fine white lines?
Well, one of the reasons is the white gel pen. I do use those a lot for highlights that are too finicky to go around with the negative space, the dark values. But one of the things that bugs me about those is they never quite match the white that's on the paper. So they're never quite the same color. I don't know if anybody agrees with me or not, but they have a little bit bluer white to them.
Uh-huh.
Especially on the more ivory colored papers, which are a little bit warmer.
Yeah.
So moleskin is notoriously kind of warm colored paper. It's not a super bright white. Epsilon paper by Stillman & Byrne, I do feel is a pretty straight down the middle white, but even then, there's a kind of a blue cast to those white gel pens. I still use them all the time, and the nice thing about me working in black and white is that I can just slide the whole drawing down to grayscale, and then all of a sudden the whites match. The white of the pen matches the white of the paper. But if you're a watercolor painter, you can't do that. So you might notice that once you add those highlights, that the white is just a little bit off, and for some people it doesn't bug me. For other people, it does.
Yeah.
Le Pen is somebody who uses those white highlights really effectively. Le Pen Barcelona, Lapin, French for rabbit. If you're not familiar with his work, first of all, I'd be very surprised.
Yeah.
But second of all, he's brilliant. He does some beautiful car sketches where he uses those white highlights with a white pen wonderfully. So for me, it's a mixture. I try to save as much of the white highlights that the paper already has as I can. Yeah. Especially for something like snow. Snow is one of those tricky things that I didn't have to deal with when I started sketching in Texas. But now that I'm in Colorado and I see it, for 3 or 4 months out of the year, I'm sketching it a lot. And pen and ink, when you try and hatch into that, it's just too much. It's too dark.
Yeah.
So trying less is more when it comes to snow, leaving it alone, letting it breathe, not giving it a hard outline. And that's where the wash really is effective. It comes in and it takes away those hard outlines, and you can just use your negative space to describe where that snow is, and it seems to work really well. Real quick, I want to show you that what I was talking about, because it was kind of, so this is some foreshortened wheels on a car, and they're straight up and down, and to me, they don't look right normally. So what I usually do with a car is I tilt the wheels this way. I tilt the ellipse. You see how they're at an angle? So if you draw a line through the longest point, you can really see the angle.
Oh yeah, right. That makes sense.
That's what happens in perspective once those wheels get to the right of your line of sight, or to the left, the angle is going to shift the other way. So once they're, the plate of the front of the wheel is sort of facing a little bit to the left of your line of sight or to the right of your line of sight, you have to shift the angle of the wheel. That is a little quick trick that makes them feel just a little bit more realistic in perspective, rather than that straight up and down. They don't quite work the same way.
No, no. All
And
right.
it's one of those things, it takes a little time for people to figure out, but then it looks great.
Okay, we're going to be closing up in
Sure.
a few minutes. So if anybody has any more questions, now is your last chance to ask them of Paul.
Yeah, let me know, and I'll try and think of anything else I want to mention. But I do talk extensively about my process, especially in the class that we've got with Studio 56 on the sketching the vintage truck. So it goes through every step in real time, while with instruction over every second of footage about starting with a pencil sketch and how sort of loose to go, how much detail to include in the pencil sketch, and then moving on to the line work, and just the initial line work, which is just establishing the sort of anchor spots where I'm going to start laying in those values with my ink wash, and then coming back in with detail. And then there's a part where it's all mixing all of that together, including, you know, hatching and ink wash and line work, and then also adding, as Mike was talking about, the white highlights on top. So it's, yeah, if you really want an in-depth look at my process, and I've been sketching a lot of cars and trucks lately. The good thing about that too is it applies to anything. I use a car or a truck as an example. In this case, it's a vintage truck. But my technique doesn't change because of the subject. So it's about understanding light and dark, and also composition, and how to sort of effectively show space. And it works whether I'm sketching an interior or exterior space, or a vintage truck, or a landscape. My approach is pretty much the same across the board.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Paul.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this chat with Paul, then I'm sure you would enjoy his online workshop, as he's been mentioning. It's called Sketch a Vintage Truck, and you're going to learn about values there. You're going to learn about foreshortening, and you're going to get to know our lovely friend Paul even better. And you can find that at the Studio 56. It's www.studio56boutique.com. You can find that workshop on our website. Thank you, Paul, for sharing with us today, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in to our chat. Any last words, Paul?
I go out and sketch. I think it's opening up out there, so just be careful.
Yeah.
But one of the nice things about if you're somebody like me who likes to sketch from your car, I think that's pretty much okay, because I think it's pretty safe.
Yeah.
And you have a nice shady spot to sketch in, which is also fun. But yeah, and sketching around the house, we've talked about this before too, but that's another fun thing that I love to do. I think it's about your approach to sketching. You can make anything interesting and fun if you have the right approach and the right attitude. So it's not really about your subject. It's just about having fun sketching.
Yeah, that's right. Good. Super. Well, thank you, everybody, and stay safe. Better days are on the horizon, and hope to see you again sometime soon.
All right. See you next time.
All right. Bye.